I confess to you, Lord, that I still do not know what time is. Yet I confess too that I do know that I am saying this in time, that I have been talking about time for a long time, and that this long time would not be a long time if it were not for the fact that time has been passing all the while. How can I know this when I do not know what time is? Is it that I do know what time is, but do not know how to put what I know into words? I am in a sorry state, for I do not even know what I do not know.
Ho-ri-o, 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 ho. Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And this time we're looking at Augustine's Confessions.
Yeah, it's a book that I think both of us have read a number of times in the past, right? So it was great coming back to it.
I've read this so many times. I had to read it so many times when I was in undergrad and in grad school doing medieval studies. There was a period where I had become so familiar with it, I sat down and read the entire book in 30 minutes once,
Ooh.
Which is like, obviously I had read it before and I knew what I was looking for and I knew where to find it, so that made it doable. But it's a 350-page book, so, it was something. I felt very proud of myself for having reached that level of achievement with this book.
It's interesting that you say it like I had to read it. Like, this is not a book you stumbled on and read out of a desire to read it, right? Like it was, how can I put it? It was part of a curriculum. It was part of an obligation.
It was assigned reading, absolutely. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying I wouldn't necessarily have read it. I've read a few other sort of autobiographies from historic figures in the past, and even books from this time period. This one in particular was assigned reading.
Yeah, I was thinking back to the first time I read it, Augustine, and I think it was in grad school also, and it was kind of funny because I came to the Confessions sort of belatedly because I was at that point, I was interested in the Middle Ages, and I was kind of, at that point, kind of mapping out the Latin Christian intellectual history of the Middle Ages, right? So I was reading kind of a lot of the big books, including books from antiquity, to kind of understand what are the main points of reference, what are the black holes, the gravitational pulls. And so I remember reading Augustine's City of God and his literal commentary on Genesis before I ever read the Confessions, which is kind of funny because I think most people come to them the other way around. They read the more, I guess, maybe drier, more theological stuff well after they've read the Confessions. And I read it the other way around. Yeah,
this was a text that was taught to me in early Christian literature class and early medieval history class. And it's sort of an obvious choice in many ways because the book is doing a bunch of different things that you can talk about. It is a text that's engaged in theological questions, but it's also a very intimate biographical, autobiographical text. And you can get a real flavor of some of the qualities of his early life through that in a way that you don't often get in early books.
Yeah, it's interesting you're saying that about it being something that might be taught in a course on early Christianity, because if you think about Augustine's Confessions, it kind of sits in the middle of a Venn diagram of a whole bunch of possible frames. And I think the most common one is, like you said, sort of Christian literature. And so Augustine gets seen as like a really big formative figure in that history, right? But he's also, and people have written about this really interestingly, as a figure of late antiquity, he's also kind of part of the classical world. He talks about loving reading Cicero and reading the Aeneid. And, he talks about all these books of antiquity and, how can I put it? Gives us a sense of him as a reader, not just an intellectual in general, but a reader. And so you can see him as part of the last stages of that ancient world too, right? And you can also see him, and some people have sort of been thinking about this in terms of not just the Roman Empire, and, that's where he spends a lot of his adult life in Milan and other parts of Italy, but he comes from North Africa and he spends the last part of his life in North Africa. So there's also that kind of Roman colony, North African dimension to his identity. And there's a bunch of other writers of late antiquity that come from that milieu too. So there's all these different boxes you can put Augustine in, though early Christian literature, I think, is for sure the main one that he shows up in.
Well, let's give a little bit of a summary of the book and, I guess, at the same time, his life, since
they're both the same thing almost.
That's what the book is about, more or less.
Yeah.
So Augustine was born in 354, died in 430, and wrote his Confessions when he was in his early 40s, around the time he became bishop of Hippo Regius, which was a city in what is now Algeria. So it's from that perspective that the book reflects on the course of his life from infancy to his full conversion to Christianity, which had happened about 10 years before he started writing the book. So in his early 30s. And he describes, sometimes in surprising, if not excruciatingly personal detail, his somewhat disobedient childhood, the petty thievery he committed with friends as a youth, and in particular, there's a famous passage about stealing some pears from a neighbor's tree. And he also talks about the fact that he really, really liked having sex. Mm-hmm. And in fact, he lives with a woman who he isn't married to for well over a decade and has a son with her, which we might talk about at some point. Anywho, in addition to these sins, he falls in with a contemporary religious alternative called Manichaeism, which at first strikes him as being much more sophisticated than Christianity. But over the years, he decides that Manichaeism isn't as consistent or as sophisticated as he at first thought, and he begins to believe in what he would think of as the humbler teachings of Christianity. He is intellectually won over to Christianity long before he's ready to commit body and soul to Christianity, famously saying at one point, "Give me chastity and continence, but not yet." Until one day, he's in a garden at a friend's house, basically, and he hears a neighbor child saying, take and read, and he picks up a copy of Paul's epistles, opens it to a random page, and the phrase that he happens to read, that's what finally inspires him to give up sex and embrace Christ. So he and his son get baptized, and then his mother, who's been a devoted mother and a devoted Christian his whole life, just hoping that her son would finally see the light. Having achieved that, his mother dies knowing that her son has been saved. And this would, in theory, be the end of the story. It's certainly the end of the plot, so to speak, and it's often where college students reading the book are encouraged to stop. Certainly the first few times it was assigned to me, that's where I was told to end. But in fact, we're barely past the halfway mark in the book. The remaining few chapters are theological reflections on the creation story told in the book of Genesis. And Augustine wonders what was going on before the creation of the universe, whether there even is such a thing as before the creation of the universe, what exactly the nature of time is, among other things, and how to interpret these passages at the very beginning of Genesis.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really trippy, right? I mean, I love those last few books, but exactly like you say, when they're taught, at least in an undergraduate setting, you don't tend to teach those last books, right? We tend to teach as the sort of autobiographical parts, books 1 through 9, but books 10 through 13 have all this really weird stuff going on. And I think it's really fun that, in talking about it today, we will talk about the earlier parts, but we can kind of dig a little bit into the time stuff and figure out what it is doing there.
Yeah. I mean, the later chapters are very specific. They're very narrowly focused.
Oh God. I would say the opposite. I'd be like, they're like, time, God, creation, change, memory.
Yeah, exactly. They're these huge topics, but in terms of like what a general reader might be interested in, you're not necessarily, if you're coming to this book trying to learn something about what one person's life in the 4th century was like.
That's not going to be there. No.
Yeah. That's not it.
No.
But when you do finally read it, like when I finally had a class where I was actually, you know what? I think I just started poking into it on my own. I don't think it was first assigned in class for me. I think I was just like, well, what is going on in those last 150 pages? And the chapter on time in particular, the book on time, just blew my mind.
Right?
It's so wild.
Yeah, same here, right? Because I remember the first time I read it, like I said, I was just reading them because these are like main books, right? So I was working my way through the main big books, right? And I got to the end of book 9 of the Confessions and it's like the end of his life story. And I'm like, what? Wait, what? Like there's a whole bunch of book left, right? And it's just, he's doing something. So it's neat to think about what is going on there because it's not accident. It's not like he's written this one thing and he's tacked on something different. It's all part of one thing. And I have a lot of complicated feelings about Augustine, some good, some bad, right? But it's clearly really smart, right? And the structure is one of the places he shows this intelligence because it's kind of telescoped. There's this really interesting way he maps out his life story in books 1 through 9. Book 1, he's given an account of his life as a child. So birth to age 14. He talks a lot about infancy and coming into the world, like the beginning for the individual. It kind of corresponds to the account of creation that will come at the end of the book. So he gives you ages 1 to 14. He's telling you about his early life in the town of Tagaste and in the local city of Madoris. And then book 2, it's him as an adolescent. That's when the whole pear incident takes place. He's about 15 or 16. Then book 3, he's a young adult and he makes it to the big city, Carthage, where, there's booze and chicks, right? And he's 17 to 20 there. So it's a good chapter. Anyway, and then book 4, he's an adult, 21 to 28. And so it's like pretty big periods of time, right, that you're getting expanded on in those books. But then books 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, it's like a year at a time. So book 5, he's 29. Book 6, he's 30. Book 7, he's 31. Book 8, he's 30. It's really, that's what I mean by telescoped, right? So he almost, like it all slows down, I guess is what I'm saying. And I find that real interesting. And then you get to this kind of climactic moment in book 9 where, it's as if it's over. And then there's the next 4 books that are doing something different.
So why does it do that? Why does it slow down so much? And part of it, I would think, is that it's really interested in this moment of conversion that happens in book 8.
Oh, yeah.
And so, in book 5, when it starts really slowing down, it's when he's finally leaving Manichaeism. Mm-hmm. And then you get this very granular sense of like, what exactly is going on in him to get him to appreciate Christianity and give up other religions, other possibilities, and then having sort of intellectually accepted it to really fully accept it. Like, what is that process? What does that mean? And like, that's one of the things that he's particularly interested in. That's one of the things that's going on with some of those later books, is trying to just understand, how does a person get from point A to point B?
Exactly. That's exactly it.
And the answer is partially time.
Well, yeah. I mean, he unpacks it. And then one of the things that's so neat is, in that protracted process, like we were talking about him making his way from Manichaeism to Christianity, but it's even more drawn out because he has this earlier infatuation with Neoplatonism. So it's sort of a philosophical school of thought that has a kind of theology to it, sort of like this idea of the good, which is sort of the divine, right? So he's in with those guys for a while. And then he's in with the Manichaeans for a while. And then he's kind of in with the Christians, but he's kind of in with one foot and not the other. You know what I mean? He's kind of interested. And like you were saying, he's intellectually on board before the conversion. Like that's the tipping point where he kind of lets himself go over the edge in some sense, with a push from that voice that you were mentioning that tells him to take it, read it, right? When to pick up the book.
But let's not let him entirely determine how that's going to be told, because it's not just these intellectual sort of big heady ideas that he's into. He's also really into sex, as we've talked about, super into it. And he's upfront about that, but that's super keeping him away from fully committing to Christianity. And also he is super into his job, so to speak, because he spends a lot of time teaching rhetoric and being sort of well known for his ability and facility with words, which is a form of power, which is a form of getting power in the Roman Empire at that time. So, like, not that he was ever the biggest, like, social climber necessarily, but it's a set of skills he has and he gets appreciated for, and it's, he likes that.
Yeah. Well, he's an incredible rhetorician, right? Like he's known for this incredible gift of eloquence and, and all that. You're right to say that, it's hard to give up the sex. He talks about this a lot, but how can I put it? There's something else going on there too. It's not just sex he's giving up. It's people. It's human beings in some way. If in a few minutes we look, I don't know if we're going to look a little bit more closely at a couple of the passages where he talks about the unnamed woman that he lived with from his late teens to his early 30s, right? Who's the mother of his son, Adeodatus. He talks about her in this really interesting kind of nuanced language. And at one point he's talking about the conversations with his friends, the men he spends time with who are to greater or lesser degrees committed to Christianity already, but they're part of this kind of cohort. And he talks a little bit about how what he enjoys, like he talks about having a household, like that he likes having a woman in the house. Like he likes all that comes along with that. Even when he talks about Monica, his mother, right, he also talks about not giving over to weeping about her, and how he anguishes over that. And he talks about his son. He's clearly devoted to him, but he's like, yeah, and he's dead, and that's fine. It's like, there's this weird, it's not just about sex, even though he presents it that way, I think. It's about the whole web of human relations that also has to be cast off, except insofar as it's mediated through a relationship with Christ.
Right.
So it's complicated, I think. It
is, but he also notably doesn't get into that as much as he could, right?
No.
We hear a little bit about the woman that he is in a very long-term relationship with, We hear a little bit about her here and there. We don't hear about the son until the mother and son are cast off when the son's about 11 or 12. They're being cast off because he's supposed to be married off to someone else now.
Well, there's a couple different passages. So there's one passage that shows up in book 4, so relatively early on. So this is when he's living in, where is he living? He's living in Carthage already, right? And he says, "In those days I lived with a woman, not my lawful wedded wife, but a mistress whom I had chosen for no special reason, but that my passions had alighted on her. But she was the only one, and I was faithful to her. Living with her, I found out by my own experience the difference between the restraint of the marriage alliance contracted for the purpose of having children and a bargain struck for lust, in which the birth of children is begrudged, though if they come, we cannot help but love them."
Right.
I mean, he's giving with one hand and taking away with the other, right? I was with her because of my restless, desire for lust, but she was the only one, and I was faithful to her. The birth of children is begrudged in a relationship like that, as opposed to a regular marriage. But of course, if children come, we can't help but love them, right? So it's like this weird, I don't know what to call it, doubleness to the way he talks about people. And then it happens again later on when he has to get rid of her.
So absolutely. But again, he is minimizing his feelings for her at the time as being largely lust-based rather than anything else. She was arbitrary, but, we got along. And then if you have a kid, you're going to love them, but not mentioning, and in fact, we'd had a kid. In fact, at this point, I'd had a kid for many years now. Yeah. And, doesn't even mention the kid's name until mom is way out of the picture.
Yeah. Well, it's like, that's why it's complicated. Like, it's not that he doesn't love these people, but he knows he ought not to love them.
Exactly.
Or at least the woman. So here's when he gets rid of her. This is in book 6. "Meanwhile, I was sinning more and more. The woman with whom I had been living was torn from my side as an obstacle to my marriage. And this was a blow which crushed my heart to bleeding because I loved her dearly. She went back to Africa vowing never to give herself to any other man and left with me the son whom she had borne me. But I was too unhappy and too weak to imitate this example set me by a woman. I was impatient at the delay of 2 years which had to pass before the girl whom I had asked to marry became my wife. And because I was more a slave of lust than a true lover of marriage, I took another mistress.
Yep.
Furthermore, the wound that I had received when my first mistress was wrenched away showed no signs of healing. At first, the pain was sharp and searing. And though the pain became duller, there was all the less hope of a cure." It's not that he doesn't love.
No.
Right? But he's constantly saying, and it was really just about lust. It was really just about lust.
Right. And part of the reason for this, I would argue, or at least as I read it, is that, we're getting this from him much later and from a very different perspective, right? He is the bishop who has to explain all this. He's talking about his conversion, and this is all how he's thinking about it post-conversion. And you can just see a little glimpse of the possibilities of what might have been his actual feelings pre-conversion allowed in. It feels like he's doing a really delicate dance around how much he cared about this woman and how much he cared about his son and in what context he was able to care about them. Because when the son comes back later and they get baptized, he seems quite, properly like a father to the son, so to speak. Mm-hmm, it's normal father-son affection and love and adventures, so to speak, and all that.
It's a bit more like they're brothers.
Yeah, well, perhaps, yeah, that's also possible because they do sort of embark on this conversion together.
Yeah, the spiritual journey, right? And they convert together. There's this beautiful passage. I always I get annoyed with Augustine because I'm like, oh God, Anyway, but there's some really beautiful passages, and this is one of them where he's talking about his son. This is in book 9 at the end of chapter 6. He says, "There's a book of mine called De Magistro, which consists of a dialogue between Deodatus and myself. You know that all the ideas expressed by the second speaker in the discussion are his, although he was only 16 when it took place, and I learned for myself that he had many other talents even more remarkable than this. His intelligence left me spellbound. And who but you," he says to God, "could work such wonders? But you took him from this world early in life. And now I remember him without apprehension, for there was nothing in his childhood or his youth or in any part of his life which need make me fear for him. We made him our companion. Together we were ready to begin our schooling in your ways. We were baptized." So it's a strange thing, right? It's like Deodatus is almost like his peer, right? They're together in this dialogue. He's a companion, right? In grace, no younger, right, than Augustine and his fellows. They begin the schooling together. They're baptized together. So they're brothers in Christ, right? That's the idea that he's communicating here, right? But it's still I don't know. I find it so poignant, right? Because he's like, yeah, I'm totally okay that he's dead because I know you're taking care of him. But it's also like, clearly he's got this great tenderness for him.
Well, yeah. Yeah, a cynical reading could also be that understanding him as a brother in Christ is another way of sort of denying your fatherhood.
I agree. No, I agree.
Which doesn't make
right?
that it isn't tender. Like, it's a complicated situation, right? But
It is super. Well, it's because families in here are so weird. I'm so fascinated by the way families work in here because there's like biological families, right? There's his mom, Monica. He talks about his father, Patricius, also, and there's his son, and then there's the woman that he doesn't name that he's with for all those years. But then there's this chosen family. There are these intimate friends he has that are clearly a chosen family. And when he goes back to North Africa later on, he makes his old house into a monastery, right? So it's still home, but it's a different kind of home.
yeah, in that period when he is on the edge of converting, as you've said, he sort of gets this very homosocial group of chosen family together. They all decide that they're going to hang out with each other and think great thoughts and etc. They're going to make a little sort of commune, a little boy house. They're all going to hang out and be boys together. It doesn't come together because these things rarely do, but so it goes. Sort of the dream.
It works for a while.
Yeah, they although they never quite all get a house and live together, they do hang out at various friends' houses and hang out in the gardens and think great thoughts, and it's apparently very nice. And it is a form of family, right? It's something that is approaching. It's like a sort of secular monastic order.
Yeah, and you see this kind of coming on, like this tremendous importance of friendship bonds comparatively early on, like already back in book 4, when I think it's one of the first times he kind of talks about time in a serious kind of way, is after the death of a very beloved friend. And he says, time never stands still, nor does it idly pass without effect upon our feelings or fail to work its wonders on the mind. It came and went day after day, and as it passed, it filled me with fresh hope and new thoughts to remember. Little by little, it pieced me together again by means of the old pleasures which I had once enjoyed. So he still is experiencing the sorrow for the loss of his friend, and he talks about this sorrow at length. But there's also something that happens with time. And I love the way he puts it. Little by little, it pieced me together again. So he's like fragmented almost by the sorrow, and time is what puts him back together. It's just almost like, I don't know what you want to call it, healing or some sort of recreation that's happening almost.
There, of course, is also the friends that earlier in his life got him to steal those pears, those pears that are attractive neither to look at nor to taste, but he steals them anyway.
And going to the arena to see the lions and the bad stuff, those boys.
Yes, it's a friendship of an unfriendly sort, he describes it.
Yeah.
And like, friendship can be bad. Like friendship with, I almost get the sense in some of these sections that we're being told that friendship with people is fraught.
It has to be a particular, how can I put it? No, I was going to say a particular kind of friendship, but that's wrong. You have to have, how can I put it? It has to be the right friend group. In other words, the relationship with God has to be, like, you have to all be friends with God. That's what he's saying. In other words, for this to work.
Yeah, like the friendship with God is better than any friendship with a human. And so you have to be with people who agree with that.
But not just that it's not just that you have this personal relationship with God, you all have that relationship. So together, you're in the relationship together. Like that's where the house comes from.
Yeah.
Right? Your house is complete when all of you are in that house with God as your friend. He doesn't use quite the language of the friend, like other theological formations will use the language of the friend a little bit more fully. But it's definitely a community, right? Where people all participate within it. And that's kind of interesting. And, that's one of the climaxes of the narrative, right? We've been talking about books 1 through 9 quite a bit, and it's neat to think about what that is. Like, who is he talking to? He says you a lot, we've noticed that in the passages we've been reading out loud, right? So he says you a lot. So he's talking to God, right? To some extent, as a kind of spoken monologue, right? To you, to God. But he's also very kind of self-reflexive at certain moments. Like, there are these weird moments where he kind of brings out the extent to which he's kind of almost talking to himself. So, for example, there's this one moment where he says to God, he says, "You were turning me around to look at myself, for I had placed myself behind my own back, refusing to see myself. But you brought me face to face with myself once more, forcing me upon my own sight so that I should see my wickedness and loathe it." So in that passage, he's talking to God, right? So it's the usual thing, but he's talking about being forced to look at himself. And of course, it's the book, right? The Confessions, in which he looks at himself. But it's not just this private thing, like he's talking to God, he's looking at himself in a mirror, but he's also addressing others too, right?
Right. He is anxious about his readership. He wants them to be able to not get bored with too much theology. At certain points, he says that. He is talking to himself. He's talking to God, although he even has sort of anxieties about that, in a sense. The opening to book 11 starts, "O Lord, since you are outside time in eternity, are you unaware of the things that I tell you?"
Right, you already know all this, so why am I saying this to you?
Yeah, do you see the things in time or do you see in time the things that occur in it? If you see them, why do I lay this lengthy record out before you? Certainly it's not through me that you first hear of these things.
No, but then he says at the end, right, he says, the reason I do it, I write this book for love of your love. Right? So it's not about information. It's about the act, right?
It's about the act, but he is also curious about understanding why is he even doing this, right?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And, he's speaking, like you said, there's an audience, right? And it's so neat to think about, like, what does he think he's doing for those people? Like, in other words, it's pretty clear. He's very clear and explicit about and asks the question of why he's saying these things he's saying to God, to you, right? And he talks at times also about the kind of mirror-like quality of the text for him himself, right? Occasionally we have that too. But this whole question of who is he writing for and why is he writing? It almost gets to the question of genre, like what is this book? I mean, at least if we think about books 1 through 9 here, right, where it's the autobiographical part, we could see it as autobiography, we could see it as life writing, but like it's also doing all other kinds of genre things as well. I feel like it's explicitly confession, right? So that's the you is he's confessing to God, but it's also a little bit like saints' lives. And that's something that people have talked about quite a bit. And also, if you remember, we were talking about the way in which the years are structured and how we really get a really quick overview of the early life, and then a detailed account of his later years, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33. It's clearly also imitating the life of Christ, right? So you could kind of line up the Gospels and saints' lives as models for this. And, it's a little bit like, remember we were reading Dante before, like when we did the Inferno and the Purgatorio, like, how can I put it? These are not modest men, these guys.
No.
Right?
No.
Like when Dante goes into the underworld and he's like, in limbo, and the poets are like, oh, wow, come join us. And he's like, so I went and joined them, blush, right? And Augustine, too, is inscribing himself in this holy framework, right? But they're both mindful of the dangers of arrogance, right? The spiritual dangers of arrogance. And so they try to mitigate that. It's a question of how good they are at it. We'll leave to our listeners.
So later in the book, in book 12, when he's talking about creation and what do the very first lines of Genesis mean? How do people interpret them? He goes, how wonderful are your scriptures, how profound. We see their surface and it attracts us like children, et cetera, et cetera. And then the next paragraph, how hateful to me are the enemies of your scripture. How I wish that you would slay them with your two-edged sword, so that there should be none to oppose your word. Gladly would I have them die to themselves and live to you. Mm-hmm. Which is a really remarkable little moment to pop up in a book that's otherwise sort of been relatively calm about people who disagree with the scriptures or are wandering down paths and investigating alternatives to Christianity. Suddenly, the death to them, and presumably death to young Augustine, but he doesn't frame it like that. He then sort of lays out, this is the case I would put to them who disagree with him. And so we also have this other audience of people who are, I guess, understanding Christianity, like believing in it and sort of interpreting Christianity, but are disagreeing with Augustine. And I honestly don't know what that's doing in this book.
Yeah.
It's very strange, but that passage really popped out at me this time.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. In book 12 in particular, the whole debate structure kind of emerges. And here, in a funny kind of way, he's both casting off the young Augustine, like you were saying, he would condemn him in the same way he condemns these others. But he's also returning to the younger Augustine in the sense that there's a tremendous rhetorical power in this section, right? So where you have this, oh, my opponent says this and this, but I respond this and this, right? And you see exactly that sort of thing going on here in book 12. We do not quarrel with anything you say, they tell me, except your interpretation of the words in the beginning. What then did he mean? I ask. And it's this kind of debate format that he brings up here. And so he says, this is a couple paragraphs after that passage, he says this: I listen to all these arguments and give them thought, but I will not engage in wordy disputes such as can only unsettle the minds of those who are listening. The law is intended for edification, and it is an excellent thing where it is applied legitimately, because its end is charity, based on purity of heart, on a good conscience, and a sincere faith. Now, that might seem like a kind of a boring passage, but the weird thing about it is it's like only about a third of it is Augustine's own words. The other parts are quotations from Scripture.
Right.
So he's doing this really fancy thing where he's taking what he's earlier described. He said that earlier I saw the rhetorical qualities of this Christian scriptures was like really low, and I was like, I don't know why people are looking at this stuff. This stuff is stupid, right? On the contrary, now he's got it elevated to such an extent that he can pull out bits and pieces, little snippets like a quilt or something that he makes out of the language of Scripture and knits it inside this incredibly beautiful Latin rhetoric.
Right.
So he's doing something that's at one and the same time harking back to young Augustine, but is totally transformed.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he has been, liberally quoting the Bible throughout and weaving it into his text. And, the translation that I've got here helpfully italicizes and footnotes all of that. So I wouldn't have been able to recognize it otherwise, I'm sure. But so that's the thing that he's been doing the whole time, and even doing that to talk about his younger self, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't know. The fact that he doesn't acknowledge the younger self in that, the fact that we've been reading this long account of somebody struggling and putting in, I mean, maybe he wouldn't have considered it an ideal approach, or, he thinks he was wayward. He's really hard on his younger self and on his childhood self for being so unwilling to listen to his parents and being so just not ideal. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of heartbreaking to read at times.
Yeah.
I think he's much meaner to himself than he should be. But even now, at this point, it's just like, yeah, if you had such a sensitive understanding of what it was like to go from point A to point B, and now it's just severe.
Yeah. Yeah. You remember that part at the end of book 9? I mean, it sounds like a totally different topic, but I swear it's related. He's talking about the death of Monica.
His mother.
And like Monica, like, oh my God, okay, I just can't. She's a handful. But anyway, because she's like, oh, you mustn't leave. Oh, you got to get married. She's really concerned for his welfare. She's a very attentive mother. Okay.
Yes.
Anyway, and he clearly really loves her too, right? And so he's been okay with her death. And, Deodatus, his Augustine's son, Monica's grandson, was weeping, and they all had to comfort him and get him to pull himself together. And Augustine has kept it all together. And then later he talks about laying alone in bed. And he says, as I did this, he says, little by little, my old feelings about her came back to me. I thought of her devoted love for you and the tenderness and patience she had shown to me. Of all this, I found myself suddenly deprived, and it was a comfort for me to weep for her and for myself, and to offer my tears to you for her sake and for mine. The tears which I had been holding back streamed down, and I let them flow as freely as they would, making of them a pillow for my heart. And now, he says, Lord, I make you my confession. Okay, this is it. Here's the confession. Let any man read it who will. Let him understand it as he will. And if he finds that I sinned by weeping for my mother, even if only for a fraction of an hour, let him not mock me. For this was the mother, now dead and hidden while from my sight, who had wept over me for many years, so that I might live in your sight. Let him not mock at me, but weep himself, if his charity is great. Let him weep for my sins to you. Yeah, it's such an odd passage. It's like, no, Augustine, like, it's okay, you're sad about your mom, right? But it's like, this is the confession, right? That I was still attached to human beings, and I know I'm not supposed to be. Right? I don't know. I find that passage really, like, one at the same time, I'm like, wow, what is wrong with you? And at the same time, I'm like, wow, it's really hard.
That's interesting. That isn't a way I was thinking of interpreting it in terms of the I'm still attached to human beings bit.
Yeah.
That is potentially interesting. I don't know. It's such a display of a type of, masculinity, right?
Oh, yeah.
It is,
yeah.
I'm not going to cry. I didn't cry. My young
and mature
son,
masculinity, right? That's like the son, well, that's fine. He should pull himself together. But
the son, he's 15. He's going to cry. He doesn't know any better.
Yeah.
but I didn't cry. And then on my own, I had a little tiny cry.
Yeah.
And I wrote about it beautifully. And I wrote about it in a way that, evokes all the right Christian sentiment, I suppose. And if somebody saw me, which is to say, if somebody's reading this, how dare they, if you make fun of me, well, be gentle. It's like, what is that move?
Well, but it's neat. I agree with you. But the really neat thing is like, this here is my confession.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's almost like that's the heart of it.
That's the most embarrassing thing he'll talk about.
Yeah. Wait, isn't that fascinating?
It is, and it's aggravating.
Augustine is nothing if not aggravating. I find him incredibly aggravating.
Well, I would like to unpack that a little bit. Like, what are some of the things that you sort of like and dislike about Augustine as a person, as you see him through here?
Remember we read Milton's Paradise Lost? It was the same thing. Like, Milton, like, beautiful poetry, love it so much. Like, what a jerk, right? And with Augustine, it's like, it's so smart and he's so intelligent, such a good writer, so formful, so beautifully balanced. And it's all in the service of, you have to not be attached to people. You have to not care about your relationships in this world because that's not important. What's important is this other world. And obviously everybody is different in terms of that, but I just find that so dystopic. And so I'm always of two minds, and I'm moved by these passages where he talks about the difficulty of giving up, the one that he has to put away, that woman, when he talks about his son, who he's so proud of, right? He's so smart and so good, right? He's so proud of him. Like, I feel really bad for him, and it's just, ugh. But at the same time, like, my God, what is wrong with you?
I feel similarly. Like, he can write some very beautiful passages, and I think this translation is a fantastic translation of it. But also, he can be incredibly harsh and cruel to himself and to people around him.
100%.
And I don't know historically, like in his life as a bishop, etc. I read somewhere that he wasn't actually all that cruel to other people, but I don't know. I'm not an expert on that. But what I like about him, what's really attractive to me, in addition to these sort of beautiful writing passages, is just the sheer anxiety in his thinking. I don't know. I don't want to medicalize it.
Well, no, he's constantly going back. It's interesting you use the word anxiety. It's neat to kind of unpack that and think about, what is that? Like, I see this kind of going back and back, and you see it perhaps above all in book 8 when he's talking about when he's getting to the conversion moment. And that is so stretched out. Like, that is stretched out of, I don't even know how many pages. It goes on for a really long time, like 8 pages.
Yeah, it totally does. My notes just have several chapters where all I've written is more angst, more angst.
Yeah, but it's just pulled out. It's just pulled out into this really protracted kind of process. And I don't think, how can I put it? I don't think we can see that description of the protracted, like he's in the garden, he's like, and I was thinking this, and I was thinking this, and I was doubting, and I didn't know, and I wasn't sure, and I knew it intellectually, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it. Like, pages and pages and pages of this.
Yeah.
I think it's no coincidence that, in the last books, he's going to be writing about time, right? Because the time telescope, we were talking about the telescoping of time in the books in general. In book 8, it gets pulled out so thin. It's like, a piece of bubble gum or something, you pull on it, it gets thinner and thinner and thinner. It's like that time in book 8.
I agree. Book 8 is a good example of it. It's all over the books. Book 11 is the one for me where it always has resonated the most, because he's trying to talk about time.
It's so wild.
And understand what happened before there was time, but that doesn't mean anything. So what could it mean? And he goes on and has several, you could call them breakdowns. That the thing that you read at the beginning of the episode, I'm in a sorry state for I don't even know what I do not know. Like, he just loses it in a way. And then he tries to catch himself and work with what he's not been able to do. But that whole chapter is fascinating. And it's because somebody is, I think this is one of the appeals of his writing at its best, is that he is willing to get really granular with his thought that's circling around itself and winding back in that pattern that I recognize as anxious thinking, as when you're worrying over an idea, that you're coming back to it from a different angle and you're just slightly, maybe you're spiraling. You're spiraling in the sense that you're coming around and around to the same ideas, but you've picked up some sort of momentum or nuance as you've done it, to the point where eventually, hopefully, you can reach some sort of conclusion or get out of that orbit or something like that. Maybe anxiety is not the right term. I'm not trying to medicalize them, but there's just something I recognize in that, and I find it very appealing when he does it, as opposed to some of that stuff that we talked about in book 12, where he seems much more certain. And that's dogmatic. Augustine is just intolerable.
Yeah, no, I agree with you completely. And I think you're right to call it anxiety. He's definitely looking for ways to quiet his mind. And some of the really perceptive readings of Augustine, I'm thinking of Brian Stock's work here, have really tried to bring out this whole idea of meditation as being part of what's going on here. Like that may seem like a kind of odd term to use because Augustine's talking about prayer and, different ways of building a relationship with God, right? But the way in which meditation gives you a centering, seems to be part of what's going on here. There's this one passage in, it's book 11, chapter 11, so 11. And, you get this sense of about the quieting of the mind and how he's trying to get to that. He says, some of these people, he says, have not learned to understand you, wisdom of God, light of our minds. They do not yet understand how the things are made which come to be in you and through you. Try as they may to savor the taste of eternity, their thoughts still twist and turn upon the ebb and flow of things in past and future time. But if only their minds could be seized and held steady, they would be still for a while, and for that short moment they would glimpse the splendor of your eternity, which is forever still. They would contrast it with time, which is never still, and see that it is not comparable. And I love this part. They would see that time derives its length only from a great number of movements constantly following one another into the past because they cannot all continue at once. In eternity, nothing moves into the past. All is present. Time, on the other hand, is never all present at once. The past is always driven on by the future always follows on the heels of the past, and both the past and the future have their beginning and their end in the eternal present. If only men's minds could be seized and held still. It's like, whoa.
It's astonishing. And that ends up being sort of his definition of time.
Yeah, like it's like that, their past, present, and future are all in this relationship. And it's that relationship that constitutes linear time. God is an eternity which stands outside of time. And what you're trying to do is get a glimpse of that.
Yeah.
I mean, Dante will say something very similar, right?
Well, no spoilers. We'll get there. We'll get there soon.
In time.
Well, I guess there's always more that we can say about the Confessions, but let's take a moment, like we often do, to talk about some of the other books that we've been reading.
Well, one thing I've been reading, which I don't know if is interesting to anybody else but me, but I went to the cloisters for the first time recently. I'd never been there, in spite of the fact that I grew up in the New York area, and I'm a medievalist, but I don't know what happened. I never went. Anyway, so I finally went, and it's so weird. Anyway, so since then, I've been reading all these books about the cloisters. So, the books they have there about the building of them and how the collection was put together. I just find the whole situatedness of it super interesting, and would love to talk about that someday. So we're reading that.
So I guess very briefly for people who don't know, the cloisters in very uptown Manhattan, is like an architectural museum amongst other types of museums. And so it consists of like bits of monasteries from Western Europe, just put together, like transported across the ocean and plonked down onto Manhattan and sewn together.
On the site of a military fortification.
Yeah.
A lot to say about that.
It's wild.
Oh, yeah. Anyway, so I've been reading that. So that's not so interesting to others. The other thing I've been reading, and I'm only partway through it, but I've been wanting to read it for a long time for reasons that will be evident to you as I describe it, is a book called Queequeg's Coffin, Indigenous Literacies and Early American Literature. And I came to it because I'm really interested in understanding a little bit more about the indigenous cultures of the Americas and the way in which writing and other kinds of ways of preserving story and other information, how that was encoded. So I came to it that way. But to my great delight, the last chapter is all about Moby Dick.
You'd assume from that title.
Well, I know, but I mean, I thought maybe it was just that was a way of framing the concept.
Right.
But the whole last chapter is like really taking Melville seriously. So I'm delighted to be coming along to that. So we may have to talk about that someday, one way or the other.
Yes. That sounds really interesting. I've been reading, let's see, 2 books, or one of them is a whole series of books, but I am rereading a book that I've been meaning to reread for a decade now, which is Samuel Delany, who we've talked about before in our episode on his Times Square Red, Times Square Blue. He has a collection of 4 books that he wrote over a 10-year period that are mostly filled with short stories. One of the books is an independent novel, but they are all fantasy. It's the Neverion series.
I've been wanting to read those.
They're so good. I really enjoy them a lot, and you might like them as well. Basically, this is an oversimplification, but Samuel Delany read a lot of theory in the 70s when theory was, French theory, when Derrida and others were becoming very prominent. And he apparently thought, what if I wrote some sword and sorcery post-Conan style fantasy books to explore these ideas?
Oh my God.
So every chapter begins with a little quote from some book or other, from Spivak or from Jacqueline Rose or from whoever. And then he earns it. It's an intriguing collection of stories. I mean, he's a great writer, but it's also just an interesting way. It's all set at that sort of Conan period, just at the quote unquote dawn of history kind of thing. It also is sort of imagined as being sort of radical translations of fragmentary texts that have been discovered. There's a whole paratext to it as well, but ultimately they're just really clever and striking stories. And it's doing that thing where, you read a text that you've read a few times, but it's been a while and you're like, oh, right, this scene is in this. And you just get very excited to re-encounter some of these scenes that have just been seared into your mind. So super good. I encourage you to read the first story in the collection at the very least. And if you like that one, keep going. And if it's not for you, that's fine. Books, that's how they work. The other thing that I'm reading, which I'm just sort of dipping into occasionally, is this very nice little collection of essays called Tongues on Longing and Belonging Through Language. It's published by Book Hug Press here in Toronto. And I'll have a link in the show notes for this. But it's just a series of personal essays about people's relationship to language. And a lot of them are non-native English speakers. A lot of them have perhaps lost an ancestral or mother language along the way. There are some First Nations writers talking about the issues with their language, things like that. It's a wide variety of perspectives. And they're just these small little essays. It's sort of like, the books that you've co-edited about how we read and how we write and so forth. It's that same kind of vibe of just very personal, very different voices expressing not variations in the same idea, but different aspects of the same idea.
It looks really good. It's a beautiful title. It looks like a really neat collection.
Yeah, it's very readable.
And the next book we're going to read.
Yes.
The Rings of Saturn.
By
W.G. Sebald. It's a weird book, but I really like it. And so I'm hoping you're going to enjoy it too. I think it's very approachable. And one of the things that speaks to me about it, and I'm really looking forward to talking about together, is the way it uses photographs and kind of integrates them into the narrative. You mentioned Samuel Delany a little earlier and his Times Square red, Times Square blue. He does that too, perhaps not quite so many photographs, but I find that so interesting to think about the ways in which word and image relate to one another. So I feel like that will be a really fun thing to talk about, among others here.
Yeah, no, you've been talking this book up to me for a while. I'm excited to finally read it.
It better be good.
It better be. It is an account of a walking tour of Suffolk, England. And what's better than that? I get the sense that it's not just that. Oh,
no. I mean, that's the backbone, right? That all this stuff is hung on to.
I like it when things are hung on to things.
Yeah. No, it's really cool. So it's like, it makes sense to have it in this cluster on time in the sense that it's about movement through a landscape over time, but it's also about how that journey can have all these other times in it also. So I feel like unpacking that together would be super fun.
Excellent. Well, I'm looking forward to that. I guess I better start reading. It's on my pile of books that I need to get back to. And it's got a new edition with a new cover, and it looks really great.
Oh, I have a grubby old edition, so.
Yeah, new directions.
That's good.
It's got a new graphic designer. Spiffed everything up. Super excited about it. But until then, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter @thespouter. We'd love to hear from you. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode are at megaphonic.fm/spouter/53, and the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time,
see you again at the Spouter-Inn.